Hi everybody, thanks for coming along today. Welcome to the second in our lunchtime learning things about our UKRI public benefit in archaeology project. I'm really pleased that Dr. Harald Fredheim is here today to talk about his input into the project, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. I just wanted to give you a brief sort of description of how to use this strange GoToWebinar system. I know I said in the invites that this would be an informal session, but the only thing that's informal about it is my lack of expertise on this platform, I'm afraid. But nevertheless, on the right hand side, you can see various opportunities for you to post questions. You're all muted currently, and at the end, when Harald launches into the question side, if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up and I will unmute you and we can hear your voices. If not, post the questions in the chat and I will attempt to marshal them to Harald and myself. Okay, back, here we are. So as I say, Harald will be talking for about 35-40 minutes and then we'll have questions after that, and I will mute myself and shut my camera down when Harald's talking to make it easier for everyone to see what he's showing on his PowerPoint. But as I say, I'm really pleased that Harald's here today. Many of you will know him, and you'll also know that he is a lecturer in museum studies in the archaeological department at the University of York. Harald has a research focus in museums, heritage conservation, and of course, public archaeology. He was a postdoc on the Heritage Futures project, and also latterly with the University of Exeter's Professor Caitlin De Silva on her Landscape Futures and Challenges of Change project. Harald's worked with us on our UKRI project hosted by Mola for a year, taking on the tricky task of the literature review, casting his critical eye on public benefit in development-led archaeology and all its challenges. Harald, I'm going to hand over to you, so I will make you the presenter. Here we go. And I will turn my webcam and mic off. If you need anything, shout and I'll try and help you.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Amazing. Okay, let's try. This is neat to as well. I'm just moving. Okay. Thanks, Sadie. Yeah, so like Sadie said, I worked at Mola for about a year on Sadie's UKRI funded Future Leaders Fellowship about maximizing public benefit from development-led archaeology. And what the literature review does, I guess I was brought in to have, I think initially maybe we talked about it as two separate reviews. One looking at how public benefit is understood and evaluated within archaeology with a specific focus on the development-led sector, but then also to look at a series of comparator disciplines to look at what maybe we could learn from other sectors. And so what we've ended up doing, so while I'm giving this presentation, I should clarify that the document that will be coming out is one that Sadie and I have written together. And it focuses first on understanding and evaluating public benefit in development-led archaeology, and then shifts over to comparators and then tries to bring that together. And I guess in a way what I'm doing in this presentation today is kind of like a summary of a summary of a summary. So hopefully that works. And I'm going to try to give you a sense of what the document that will be coming out soon will look like, but also some kind of snapshots of what the content is like as well. So I thought I'd start off with this slide about what the review is and is not, because I think when we say literature review, this may be different for different people, but certain kinds of ideas or perceptions come to mind. And there are obviously different ways of approaching a literature review, and we had several conversations, both Sadie and myself, but also with other colleagues at Mola, about what we wanted this review to be. And we made a decision so that the review is what's called a narrative literature review as opposed to a systematic review. So some of you may be familiar with systematic reviews, which are more structured in that they have maybe a set of search terms. And so you search a range of different databases using keywords, and then you analyze all of those as objectively as possible, if you like, in terms of to say what the literature says on a topic. Now, there are several reasons, I guess, why we chose to go along the more narrative route rather than the systematic route. And one of those is that we weren't, so thinking about the archaeology section first, we weren't primarily interested in analyzing the public archaeology literature, which is very large. But instead, we are more interested in understanding, I guess, how what's published in the literature, how public benefit is understood and related. And the reality is, while there are all kinds of rabbit holes that you could go down in a review like this, there isn't actually that much that explicitly focuses on public benefit and what that means and how we understand it. And so because of that sifting process and the specific focus that we wanted to have, we have, I guess, followed more organically the literature we know, but also using searches in databases. As I said, the literature is huge. I can't claim that we've read anywhere close to everything, and it's selective in all kinds of ways. It's focused primarily on the UK, but we're bringing literature from other places, and it's very much also focused on English language sources. So it is selective, it is thematic, so we've broken it down into a series of themes, and what we're trying to do is to give kind of a bite-sized overview, introductions into a range of different lenses or perspectives on this literature, that hopefully both work as summaries or work as overviews, but that also highlight, for those of you who want to explore it in more detail, that you could do that yourself as well. And so the main parts of the report, the document we've been working on, the first section is about understanding and evaluating public benefit within archaeology, but with a specific focus on the development-led sector. Then the second section brings in, so this is then, if you like, the second literature review or second element of it, looking at a series of comparator fields, comparator disciplines, how is public benefit understood and evaluated there, and what can archaeology learn from these sectors. And then in the final section, trying to pull things together and map out a pragmatic way forward, if you like, in terms of how we can think about, approach, and do future work in relation to public benefit and development of archaeology. And so this document is both an internal document to the project in terms of highlighting ideas and raising questions that the project could go on to explore in more detail as it continues. But also we hope an invitation for readers, both archaeologists, whether practitioners or more academic, and also maybe also people from other sectors could have an interest in understanding how we think about public benefit, but also how we see these trajectories potentially going forwards in the future. So moving then into the first section of our report, here is the content of this first section that focuses on archaeology. So we introduced development-led archaeology. We have a spotlight snapshot on a few development-led sector bodies. So what are the professional organizations in this area? We focus in on archaeology and public benefit, on our cultural publics, who is the public, who are the public, what do we mean by this? We look at charitable and non-charitable archaeologies, so different kinds of archaeological organizations that do work in the development-led sector, how they're organized and how that potentially impacts how they approach work in relation to public benefit. We have a section looking at evaluation, and then we have a case study snapshot or spotlight, as we're calling them, on Dig Ventures and their approach to evaluation. As an example of a framework that has been a bespoke evaluation framework, if you like, that we think is quite rare, certainly in terms of an archaeological organization that has shared an evaluation framework that they've worked on and put together. These icons or logos on the right hint to that we've been working with Tracy Wellman, the in-house illustrator and designer at MOLA, to liven up our report, if you like, and also in terms of how we organize the content. So for each of these sections in bold, in the list on the left, they're broken down into 4 sections. The first section is a textbook answer. So the textbook answer on what is development archaeology or who are archaeological publics. Then we have the fire, if you like, the critics' corner. What are the critics saying or critiquing the textbook answer, if you like, then this brings us to a key question that we then try to unpack and explore through a series of ideas illustrated by this light bulb, bringing us back to more questions that will then be taking forwards. The project might be taking forwards, also invitations to conversations with people like yourselves. And then this spotlight icon is what we use to highlight these other sections and not in bold. So we have a spotlight on development-led sector bodies, a spotlight on charitable and non-charitable archaeologies, and a spotlight on evaluation and dig ventures. Now, I'm not going to be able to go over all these sections because of time, but I'm going to highlight some of them and give you a sense of what they look like and what's in these sections. So this is a screenshot from the section on archaeological publics, so one of the ones that Tracy has laid out for us. And so what we try to do here is for each of these sections, they have 4 pages or 2 double spreads, if you like, where on the first page on the left, we have the textbook answer with a small illustration or graphic. And then we have the critics corner with the fire on the right, bringing the questions with footnotes so you can follow up on our citations. And then on the following 2 pages, so this again connects to archaeological publics in the section, we have our key question that we synthesize out of having brought together the textbook answer with the critics corner into conversation. We then pull out 1 or 2 questions as the key question that we then follow up on with these light bulb or idea sections that are both our ideas, but primarily ideas, again, that are taken out from the literature. And this brings us then to these questions we're taking forward in the bottom right-hand corner. And so each of these main sections is laid out in this way. And we're hoping not just that the color looks nice and is hopefully engaging, but that the way we've tried to synthesize all this information down into these smaller units will make it easier for the reader, I suppose, to dip in and out of the text and look at the sections they're interested in and follow up however they like. So that's in terms of the layout of what this first section looks like. Now I'm going to transition a bit more into the content. Tracy has also made a couple of illustrations, so two versions of this illustration for us, which we use to try to introduce what development-led archaeology is. How does the sector work? What does this look like? And we're very aware of that the sector doesn't work identically in different parts of the country. Well, certainly within the UK, I should say we focus on England in this review. And also, Sadie knows this way better than me, obviously, but there are differences between how things are done in London, for example, as opposed to other parts of the country as well. But just quite briefly, going over this illustration, in the top left-hand corner at number 1, you have the developer who hires a consultant, who then approaches the local authority archaeologist and invites contractors to tender. Then here at 2 and 3, we have the contractors lining up with their tenders. They do a desk-based assessment, and this brings us to the first of our roundabouts or intersections, junctions, if you like, which here we have the red card symbolizing the local authority archaeologist, sitting within this as kind of managing or being the central pivot, if you like, at this point in the process. So the local authority archaeologist might review the desk-based assessment and make a decision about how this archaeological work will progress. Either that if we look towards 5B with a goal of digger, that the desk-based assessment has highlighted that there's no need for further evaluation, and so we progress straight to construction. Or 5A, the contractor then performs an evaluation, which brings us to a second intersection. And again, those of you familiar with the process. But here again, so you might have 7A, where there's a watching brief, either leading to more detailed archaeological work or construction, or back to the roundabout, we might come to 7B, where already you go into a full excavation. Bringing us to the next roundabout, again, governed by the local authority archaeologist. initiating the post-excavation assessment, and then leading to the post-excavation analysis and dissemination on the one hand, while the construction commences in the other direction. And so following on from this visual introduction, we have a section on development-led archaeology where we trace some of the historical background to how we got to today in our textbook answer section. So again, many of you may be familiar, but we're creating this document both, as I said, internal to the project, internal to the sector, but also looking externally as well. So with PPG 16 in 1990, we have the introduction into legislation of what's known as the polluter pays principle, the idea that the developer should be paying for mitigation of their impact, and this includes archaeological work. And that the main focus here then is on this paradigm of preservation by record. So archaeological work takes place in advance of development, and an archaeological archive is created, which both is a collection of finds and a written record. From 2010, new shift in legislation, Planning Policy 5, and one of the key things coming out of here in the language is this shift from talking about mitigation to talking about offsetting. And so introducing this idea that we're not just mitigating impact, but we're trying to offset the damage or the impact, if you like, of development through delivering public benefit. And so this, in a way, is where we take this key concept about public benefit from, which then has stayed in legislation since. And historically, so in our document, we refer to the Southport group a few times, which met in 2000, around this time as well, came out with a document in 2011, very much in the spirit of how the sector saw perhaps opportunities or shifts coming out with this policy, the policy shift to Planning Policy 5, with the move to offsetting, and with then this idea that maybe public benefit could take more of a center stage. In terms of how this process is managed, and I touched on this in terms of going over the graphic quickly, local authority archaeologists set planning conditions, and they're responsible to make sure that those conditions are met. Whereas consultants working for the developers, they hire the contractors, and they also do an element of quality control on behalf of the developer to make sure that the developer gets value for money out from what the archaeological contractor, the actual work that takes place on the ground. In our definition of development-led archaeology, we also include infrastructure projects, and it's worth noting that we're aware that infrastructure projects have a slightly different trajectory, and the bodies involved are slightly different from what maybe we would usually think of as, strictly speaking, being development-led archaeology through the planning system. But in terms of thinking about public benefit and evaluation, these systems are relatively similar, and the different actors that are involved. And for those of you who don't know, just worth stressing, the vast majority of archaeological work in the UK takes place within the sector of the planning system and of the infrastructure projects. But when we look at the literature, development-led archaeology is largely absent in terms of when we talk about or write about public benefit. Moving then from the textbook answer to the critics' corner with our fire logo in the top. What critics say then is that archaeology is about knowledge generation, yet it's being performed as a service to developers to comply with planning regulations, and that there's a disconnect here in terms of what good value for money or what a quality product looks like from the archaeological lens, as opposed to the planning system or the developer's lens. And what this has led to is some archaeologists criticizing development-led archaeology for effectively being cost-effective land clearance. So saying that what drives the competition in the sector, what drives practice, is being able to clear land for the developer as cheaply as possible. That's a crude critique perhaps, but it's certainly one that is quite prevalent in the academic literature in this space. Others argue that competitive tendering erodes working conditions And there's been quite a lot of studies done around this as well, looking at why people leave the sector at different stages, but thinking about job security, thinking about pay, how this is connected to the competitive tendering system, but also how work is divvied up between different contractors can also create problems in terms of the archaeological process itself. Some critics describe work in the development sector, or that the pressures of the sector push work towards becoming a more standardized and technified data generation practice, kind of pulling out a lot of the more interpretive elements of archaeological work, and that it leads to these huge unfunded archives, which also then create kind of a legacy problem in terms of where do we store the archaeological material, and who uses it in the future, and how's that work funded if it's not being funded by the developer. Also, critics say that there is some benefit coming out of the development-led system, but that there's this general sense that there could be more. And also that the case studies that we often flag about really great projects aren't necessarily representative of most of the work that takes place in the space. Others have also highlighted, for example, that some archaeological charities and nonprofits may not spend more than, so there's this 2.1% number that's thrown around of their turnover on community public archaeology and educational work, despite being educational charities. How's this possible? What does this mean? What does this tell us about the sector and problems in it, I suppose? So bringing together then the textbook answer here with the Critics' Corner leads us to these two questions. On the one hand, should there be a national or a public archaeology service funded by a developer tax? And secondly, how can we maximize public benefit within the current system? Now, in terms of how we try to answer this or move towards answers in our ideas section, we focus more on the second question here, recognizing that certainly in the context of the UK at the moment, we're more likely to be facing a shift towards deregulation rather than a more regulated environment where archaeology is brought firmly into public spending. And so because of that, we suggest that our focus should be on demonstrating our worth to developers on the one hand, and to different publics on the other. In that it's support from the public that leads to support for the sector through regulation, but also if we can prove our worth to developers, then potentially archaeology can have a larger role within the development process and be brought in earlier on in the project design stages. This shift from offsetting to mitigation, we think there's something to be said for that in terms of taking that on board in terms of how we think about work in the space, that maybe thinking instead of development as being a threat to archaeology, it's actually an opportunity to do archaeology, but also an opportunity to deliver public benefit that is funded through development work that wouldn't, so that public benefit couldn't be delivered otherwise, so to speak. We think there's a lot of scope, and others have said this as well, to being more specific in terms of setting public benefit conditions within written schemes of investigation that govern the archaeological work that takes place in any given project. And that it would be helpful to have clearer public benefit requirements from sector bodies in terms of what constitutes good or professional archaeological work. We also think there's a role here for consultants to advise their clients to choose projects or to choose tenders, if you like, that provide the best return on investment as opposed to simply the lowest cost. And we know this happens in some contexts. And this, of course, also has to be facilitated by contractors writing tenders that highlight added value, also in a language that developers understand, and we'll come back to this. And crucially as well, we think it's important here to try to close the gap between the ideals of how we think about what archaeology can provide in terms of public benefit and the day-to-day realities of archaeological work and how those benefits may or may not be generated in practice from how we work on the ground. Taking us then to our series of final questions that we're bringing forward. Why have public benefit focused policy and guidance changes not led much of changes in practice? So thinking about the shift in 2010 with Planning Policy 5. What do archaeologists in different roles actually think about public benefit? So is this lack of a shift related to how we think about public benefit within the sector? Which it may or may not be. To what extent do the different timelines, geographic scales, and workflows of infrastructure and development-led archaeology impact public benefit delivery? And how can public benefit be maximized at each stage of the archaeological process? So some of these questions are ones that we come back to a bit in the report, but mostly the ones we're opening up for discussion in a context like today, but also to take forward. Shifting then to our section on archaeology and public benefit. How, looking at the textbook answer again now, for how we understand what public benefit is. Generally within the literature, this I think is taken from an article by McMerriman and Hedley Swain, so early 2000s. They write that in general, archaeologists think of public benefit being delivered through preserving archaeological sites, objects, and records for future generations, but that public benefit that is provided through these preservation actions, but also who these future generations are, isn't very clearly articulated, they suggest. In terms of looking over, so CIFA has come out with a series of documents highlighting the kinds of benefits that can be delivered through archaeology. And in terms of synthesizing these together, generally, I would suggest that they say in addition to through preservation, public benefit is delivered in the form of knowledge gained and shared from scientific investigation and from public participation in the archaeological process. So these are the two key parts to where public benefit comes from, if you like. And they break this down in a lot more detail that we do flesh out in the report, but that I'm not highlighting here in this presentation. And also to flag that in terms of CIFA standards and guidance, and their vision statements as part of their 10-year plans, etc. CIFA expects archaeology to be performed, that archaeology that is performed to professional standards will bring real benefits from people's daily lives. So there's this connection here that professionalization, working towards standards, delivers archaeology that does bring real benefits to people's daily lives. And this phrase, real benefits to people's daily lives, is one that comes again in several documents. If we then turn to the critics, the critical voices in this space, people argue that archaeology continues to struggle to demonstrate public benefit beyond communicating information. Again, you may or may not agree with these critiques. Critics argue that archaeology lacks sufficient theoretical and ethical frameworks to really kind of grapple with and deliver public benefit. The report that came out in 2011 from the Southport Group felt that archaeology could use this policy shift to deliver more public benefit, but reflections on this since have suggested that this shift or this increased public benefit that should be possible in this space hasn't really materialized. And I wanted to flag here as well the EU-funded NEARC research project, which ran a survey using a respondent database that's supposed to be representative for the UK. Several interesting findings from that, but as always, when you as a researcher is looking at someone else's research, you wish they'd been asking different questions. But one thing I wanted to highlight here is in terms of what their respondents, what their UK respondents said were the primary things, or the primary benefits or impacts that they recognized from archaeology. These three things that I've listed here scored very low. And these three things happen to be things that we say archaeology delivers all the time. And so I'm not saying that archaeology doesn't deliver these, but the popular perception of archaeology is not, first and foremost, that we contribute to the economy, that we participate in sustainable development, or that we contribute to daily life. And I think that is significant. whether or not we think we do contribute in these areas, this survey suggests that there isn't a great public understanding of that archaeology contributes in these spaces. So bringing together the critics and the textbook answer again, we come to these questions that we've pulled out. Why do some archaeologists claim archaeology delivers public benefit while others claim it doesn't? There seems to be a very clear disconnect here. And what does public benefit even mean? And I'm not being facetious when I say that. I think from the literature, it is not clear what public benefit means in an archaeological context. So moving then to our ideas, our light bulb moments, if you like, we suggest, or I think this is quite clear, that there's a conflict still in the sector between the idea that archaeology is beneficial in its own right, and those that think, but equally those that then are concerned about efforts to be making archaeology more useful or more impactful. So there's a clear kind of disconnect here in terms of how people feel about what value from archaeological work means or should mean. Often, when we talk about public benefit in relation to archaeology, and this is also true in arts and culture more generally, which comes out from our arts and culture comparator, that our takes are often very defensive, in that when we write about these things, we're usually trying to justify and explain why, well, of course, archaeology is valuable. And what this leads us to do often is highlight case studies to say that archaeology can deliver public benefit, yet in reality, there's very little connection between those case study examples that we provide and what we require in our professional standards, but also, I suppose, the reality of what most projects in the space are like. And I would suggest that while I can understand that you can be put in a situation where you're going to force to be defensive, I think we can be more proactive in this space to think more productively about what archaeology does deliver, what it could deliver, and how we can do that, to take a more active role rather than this defensive stance. We think there's a real need for honest, internal, maybe to organizations, also to the sector, discussions about public benefit. So taken out of this context of having to prove our worth to others, how do we think our work should be delivering public benefit, and what do we think that should mean internal to the sector? But also, so what are the public benefits we want to deliver, but also needing to understand what the public wants from us. What do different publics want from us? And this, of course, connects with the work that Kate Faccia is doing for the project and presenting on again next week. And then we end with this question of, can we really talk about public benefit and real benefits to people's daily lives, taking this phrase from the CIFA documents, without asking what they, saying publics, consider to be beneficial? And so following on from this, there's a section on archaeological publics, how we understand the public within archaeology. I'm skipping over that today. Before we get to that, so these questions that we pulled out, so skipping over that section on understanding archaeological publics, what we do here in the report is bring back this graphic from earlier on in the presentation to try to say, where can we think about public benefit delivery within the archaeological process? And so in addition to our three cars, the pink consultant, the red local authority archaeologist, and the blue contractor, we've introduced a teal or turquoise bicycle representing publics for the public. But really to get that conversation started about what we can have, these big plans about how we could completely change the way we work. Again, thinking more pragmatically, how can we think within the structures of the way a development-led archaeological project takes place, or how it happens? How can we insert thinking more proactively about public benefit? Where does that sit in the different parts of the process? So inviting that conversation. Then moving on to evaluation, I'm going to try to go through this quite quickly. In our textbook answer section, we highlight that there's a long history of concern for the quality of archaeological work. In general, historically within the discipline, this has been most closely connected to the final publication. both whether or not a final publication ever is written, but also what the quality of that final report or final publication, rather than, for example, what happens during the time of the excavation itself, if you like. So we're evaluating the report rather than evaluating the work or the practice, even though those two things are obviously connected. I'm not suggesting they're not. In development-led archaeology, evaluation, even though the word evaluation is also used to mean something else, the assessment of quality, if you like, is brought into the realm of the written scheme of investigation. And here I've taken two quotes from two different CIFA standards that highlight that an investigation should not be should not take place on the basis of a brief alone, as it could not achieve the appropriate standard, there being insufficient detail against which to measure performance. So this idea of measuring performance is built into CIFA standards. Written schemes of investigation should contain enough detail about research aims to provide a benchmark against which the results of the work may be measured. So again, this idea of measurement is built into written schemes of investigation, yet quality assessment or evaluation, there isn't really guidance for that within CIFA standards, how that should take place. And most of these assessments are informal, or reports are certainly not made public. And so there's a general absence of publicly available reports on the quality of archaeological work that takes place in the space. If we look to the Critics' Corner, again, and this is not unique to development-led archaeology. If we look at evaluation of archaeological work more generally, there's just a general lack of robust evaluation data and published evaluations. One reason for why this is the case within the sector is the competitive nature of the sector, but I think given how this is also true of archaeology more broadly, I don't think that's the only factor at play here. So as I say, not unique to development archaeology. Some people have looked to the National Lottery Heritage Fund funded projects because they require an element of an evaluation within that system. So archaeological projects that are funded through the lottery, for example, to look for evaluation documents. And while some of these exist, research that's been done on lottery fund evaluations suggests that generally the standard of evaluation here is quite low. And within the framework for understanding impact and benefit that the lottery fund uses, it doesn't necessarily differentiate between engagement and benefit. And so the types of, maybe you could say so many people were involved, but beyond that, we're not getting very much in terms of what people are actually getting out of these archaeological projects funded by the lottery. So bringing these things two together, again, we come to this question: how can evaluation of public benefit productively be integrated in development-led archaeology? Which brings us out again to a series of ideas, these light bulbs, where we call for, but not just us, this is also in the literature, there's a call for a step change from preservation by record to mitigation and tick box mentalities to looking foregrounding public benefit, new knowledge and value for money. We think there's a real need for frank evaluation of the benefits projects deliver to different publics. And primarily what we're calling for here is evaluations we can use internally, I'll come back to this, to improve our practice rather than to demonstrate our worth to others, although that is also important. We think there's a lot of scope for archaeology to take ownership over what we mean by public benefit in this space, because in policy documents that isn't very clearly defined. So what it means to offset the harms of development through public benefit provision, the scope here for us to be active in that space in terms of saying what that means. And so coming back to this point about creating evaluation structures to improve our practices on our terms. So if we can sit down and say, what do we want to do in terms of providing public benefit? We can create evaluation structures that help us actually do better work in this space, rather than just assume that what we do is great already. And then also thinking about how we can connect this to demonstrating our value on how we could deliver more to developers if we could move up or be brought into project designs earlier on in the supply chain. So what I'm going to do now before I wrap up, moving into the second part of the review, I'm just going to whiz through, so just highlighting here, the different comparative fields we look at are infrastructure, construction and housing, ecosystem services, arts and culture, well-being, international development, and higher education. And obviously each of these are huge in their own right. And what we do is try to look at each of them in just 2 pages of A4. So it's very short. And so again, coming back to summarizing a summary, what we do is we provide an introduction to what the sector is, how they think about public benefit. We adapt a diagram that is used within the sector to illustrate what public benefit means in this space. Then we have a paragraph on the next page where we talk about evaluation, how evaluation is approached in this space. And then we have a paragraph where we try to think about parallels to archaeology and what archaeology could learn from each of these sectors. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going through each of them very quickly and just highlighting the different diagrams that we're adapting. So Tracy's working on these with us, is to adapt these diagrams that have been developed for each of these sectors to ones that can help us better understand how they think about conceptualize public benefit in each of these spaces. So this is taken from the Barber review. For construction and housing, we draw on this model, which here you'll see has the UK Social Value Bank in the center. So this is a cost benefit analysis, like there's a value bank where you can add in what you're doing and it gives you numerical values for the worth in pounds of different things. That's used a lot in construction and housing. Ecosystem services, here with the different kinds of ecosystem services and the different relationships between the different types of ecosystem services and the different elements of well-being, or which you can think of as a model for public benefit, if you like. So we'll be cleaning up and simplifying these models. Within arts and culture, here, many of you may have seen these before. We're thinking about the different outcomes that come from arts and culture projects. Within well-being, Kate talks about this more in her seminar, so that will come back next week. This is from the What Works for Well-being model in terms of understanding the different components of well-being and how the different indicators that are used to measure well-being as well. For national development, we looked at the Sustainable Development Goals. Within higher education, we don't have a pretty graphic because higher education doesn't have one, to my knowledge. So we're working with Tracy to create a graphic that will at least highlight this baseline information about how what's called research impact sits within the higher education system in terms of how institutions are evaluated and allocated funding. And here within the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, impact, which was introduced for the REF in 2014. So it's quite new for higher education to be thinking about this, but measures impact through these 2 different components of reach and of significance. And so we reflect on, is that a helpful model or not for us to think about in the archaeological sector? And then finally, so I'm wrapping up now, we come to this section where we try to pull it all together. And partially, as I said, because this presentation is a summary of a summary of a summary, in a way, I'm not going to now give a summary at the end of that. But what we do in this section is we highlight 2 large-scale projects that Sadie is involved in different ways. So High Speed 2 is a partner organization for the fellowship. And the Construction Innovation Hub is another big project funded by UKRI, bring together a lot of different construction-related bodies, and they're creating, one of their work streams is the value work stream, and they're creating this model of thinking about how do we understand social value in relation to construction. So Sadie's being both kind of having a voice in trying to shape some of this, but also thinking about how archaeology can fit into these different value models that they're using. And then with High Speed 2, thinking about how HERDS, the archaeological strategy, does or does not connect with these higher level aims for High Speed 2 and when it delivers. And here's our contact information if you want to get in touch. And that's all from me.
Fantastic, Harald. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and turn my camera back on. There we go. Thank you very much for that. You packed a lot in to that 40 minutes. That was excellent. Thank you. There are some questions actually already. So is it okay